We pick up here with the War of 1812 with the second half discussion. But before we get moving into that, I just want to go back just one other American success that we have not discussed. And this one occurs in the west towards the Canadian area. And this is known as the Battle of the Thames. I know it looks like Thames, but it's Thames. And so that's named for the same river that's over in London. But this is an attack by William Henry Harrison and his forces after the Americans had seized control of Lake Erie. So he's into what today is parts of Canada and pushes Tecumseh and the British general there. And this is a resounding victory for William Henry Harrison. And what's even more important here is that Tecumseh dies in this battle. And that is very important because, of course, with his death, so ends the hope and dream of an Indian confederacy. I do want to mention that there were plenty of American failures in the War of 1812. Going back just a little bit, one of the first ones, which was a huge embarrassment to the Americans, is that at the time, Fort Detroit, if you look up here, there on the upper peninsula of Michigan, Fort Detroit was captured by the British without the Americans actually even fighting for it. So in this little painting right here, the American commander, his name was William Hull. He was an older gentleman from the Revolutionary War, and he was afraid if the British had won that the Indians would massacre his men. So he was guaranteed that that would not happen if he surrendered without the actual fight. And so this actually occurs in the first few weeks of the War of 1812 in the upper Great Lakes area. The other was much better known, and that is obviously the attack on the national capital by the British and the burning of the White House and the Capitol and some other buildings. Luckily, the only thing was that President Madison wasn't actually in Washington, D.C. at the time. His wife, Dolly, actually saved an important portrait that hung in the White House. This is that portrait. Okay, right there it is. It's pretty large. It stands about 6 or 7 feet tall. So it's a very large portrait. And so she actually ordered the staff to basically break it out of its frame, roll it up, and save this portrait. So the date of this is a little bit further in the war. This actually happens in the summer of 1814. Our nation's capital is burned. So is the White House itself. It's just a shell of a building because it is actually built of stone. But everything else inside of it was burned to the ground. Now, I always like to share sort of modern day parts of U.S. history. So here is the Hamilton cast at the White House when Barack Obama was president. And you can clearly see the President Washington painting. So it also gives you an idea of the immense size of the portrait. So it still hangs there, and there's also a copy, I believe, in one of the museums in the Smithsonian. So as the war drags on, we have a mixed bag of success and failure. So again, the attack on Washington, D.C. occurs in the summer of 1814, and that was a huge, debilitating defeat for the Americans. But the British did not stay in Washington, D.C. It was pretty much a raid that they raided in. They burned the Capitol, burned the White House, and then due to some wild rumors of a force moving on them, they actually abandoned the Capitol after doing what they had done. They then move on to attack another famous part of the War of 1812, was the attack on Baltimore. So this occurs in September 13th and 14th of 1814. The most famous part, of course, is when Francis Scott Key watches Fort McHenry being bombarded and is inspired to write what we call the Star-Spangled Banner. He calls it In Defense of Fort McHenry. But this will go on to become our national anthem, and not until the 1900s. So even though it was written way back then and it was sung, it was not actually formally adopted until, I believe, into the 1930s. So just getting a little bit further into the attack on Baltimore. The next picture here, this is actually Fort McHenry. It's down there in Baltimore. You can go and tour it. It is a national site. And so this was the fort that was going to guard the city of Baltimore. And so the British realized to take Baltimore, they would have to get past the guns and this fort at Fort McHenry, Baltimore. So in some of these pictures here, you can sort of see the bombardment of the fort by the British fleet. And what happens is that this would be Francis Scott Key, and in the background he can see the fort being bombarded. Now, the reason why he was on the ship was that he was trying to get the release of a friend of his that was a doctor, and he basically was rowed out, and he basically gave his case to the British admiral, and the admiral said, okay, we'll release him, but since you're here, you're going to have to just stay the night. And that was the night that they bombarded Fort McHenry. And so he realized that if the flag was still flying the next day, then the Americans had not capitulated, they had not surrendered. And so that's what inspired him to write the national anthem. Surprisingly, the national anthem has, I believe, 4 stanzas. We only sing the first one. But this, of course, will be a famous song sung to actually a British song of the day. So, just some more pictures of the original Star Spangled Banner. So, this is a dated picture because when I saw it, they had taken it down and they were in a process of actually cleaning it over a period of about 3 years. There were these specialists that know how to clean artifacts. And so this was behind glass, and they were actually working on it. And sometimes there was actually like almost ladders that they were over top of it. So when I was your age, this is the way I used to see the Star Spangled Banner. Every hour on the hour, they would lower this wall and the actual flag would hang behind it, and they play the national anthem. But then experts realized, you know what you're doing? You're actually tearing the flag apart. The weight of it is actually kind of destroying it. So they took it down, and they spent lots of time and money cleaning it so you can now see it. And it's the centerpiece of the United States Museum of American History. It's behind glass, humidity controlled, everything else is really cool. I encourage you guys, when all this is done, to go and see it. It's a fascinating site down there in the Museum of American History. So the last major battle of the war is a unique one because as the two sides were fighting, there were representatives over in Belgium working out if they wanted to continue this war and perhaps peace negotiations can begin. So in your reading, you read about a place called the Battle of Plattsburgh. It's not overly, fascinating, but that battle happens in northern New York, and it pretty much stops the British from moving in, and it also convinces them to pretty much to end the war. And so they begin that process, and they actually wrap it up on Christmas Eve, 1814 is when that happens. But again, just like the way that this war started, the way it ends is really strange because the British also had a force moving towards the city of New Orleans. They realized that New Orleans was such a key that they wanted to capture it. So the British move on that city, and then a frontiersman who had been fighting Indians and those type of things, he gathers a force, and it's a mixture of runaway slaves, there's some buccaneers, there's some pirates, and they defend the city of New Orleans, and it's led by Andrew Jackson. And so the culminating battle happens January 8, 1815. And there, Jackson and his forces are able to turn back the British, and it is a resounding defeat. And Jackson becomes this national celebrated hero, which eventually he's going to ride into the White House. So most of you don't know, but this battle actually happened after the peace treaty. So you can sort of see it occurs January 8th, so almost about 3 weeks after the peace treaty was signed. Most of you can recognize Jackson on the $20 bill. This is probably the way that he would have looked at the time of the actual battle. So this kind of brings the war to a close. The Treaty of Ghent ends the war. We really don't get new territory. We do stand up to the British, but in some ways the war is kind of a draw on both sides. So there is the end of the War of 1812.